Hi. Thank you. Thank you very much. Are you excited? I am. Good. This is going to be, I hope, a remarkable evening. And I hope we'll get it done in less than 5 or 6 hours. I want to say that we're going to do the format that many of you are used to, where Noam and I are going to have a dialogue, which is going to go a little longer than normal because there's a lot more stuff to talk about. Then we're going to have an intermission, and you can scurry down with your questions, and there'll be people here to take them. And also, the first time, you can tweet your questions, and they'll be recorded backstage, and then we'll be choosing them, and then we'll come out and answer questions. This is, for me, perhaps one of the hardest dialogues I've been involved in the Origins Project because of the individual I'm about to have the dialogue with. Noam Chomsky is so many things, and you know many of them in your program. One could call him the father of modern linguistics, establishing essentially a whole field, which is itself a rare thing to do. He's written over 100 books. He was named in at least several surveys as the top public intellectual in the world, and certainly in 2005 and twice since then. In at least one survey, one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. This is all said without hyperbole. That is substantiated because one of the things I learned from Noam is to always try and substantiate claims. He has been cited more than any other living scholar in the humanities and arts between 1980 and 1992. He, besides being an incredible intellectual, he came to the public domain during the Vietnam War, during which he bravely was one of the first people to openly protest and led much of the protests against the Vietnam War, during which he became an American. During which he certainly became an American hero. It established a tradition for him of being marginalized in U.S. media. We were just noticing, some of you may have seen the New York Times online, that there was a interview with him on racism. It's in online. You won't find it in the hard copy, because the last time Noam was interviewed or quoted in the New York Times was in the 1970s. Which says something which we'll get to in this discussion. This is also a very personal moment for me, and it would be disingenuous not to mention it because I'm sure it'll creep in. I'm not a big believer in hero worship because you usually are disappointed. But I do have a few intellectual heroes too, to be exact, and people that I always thought I would want to emulate if I ever got to be in a position even remotely like theirs. Those two people are Richard Feynman, who I wrote a book about, and Noam Chomsky. I had the opportunity to know both of them, but I got to know Noam when I was a graduate student at MIT. MIT has the wisdom to not require you to take any courses if you're a graduate student, which was wonderful. So I didn't take any physics classes, but I took 2 courses in U.S. foreign policy from Noam Chomsky. And it was a revelation to me. The first thing that personally impressed me about him was a man who took time out from a field that he clearly loved, linguistics, to talk about issues that matter to people. The courses that he taught for me at MIT were courses that weren't on the curriculum. He just voluntarily taught these courses in addition to his regular curriculum because he thought they were important. As a graduate student, not in linguistics but in physics, I would walk into his office periodically and sit down and ask him a question. And we would talk for an hour, and I was just overwhelmed that he took me seriously. He showed me a kind of respect which I did not expect. And the last thing was that when I went, and Noam spends a lot of his time, and has always spent a lot of his time, out in public. And in Cambridge, there are many times when I was fortunate enough to go listen to him. And what impressed me was not just his discussions, but afterwards, he answered questions well past midnight to the last person that asked the question. He showed a kind of respect and generosity for people's interests that is not common in most public intellectuals. And I always hoped that I would try and emulate those things. And every time I'm in that situation, I think of Noam. And some people say, what would Jesus do? But I ask, what would Noam do? So it is therefore one of the... It is therefore one of the truly greatest honors of my life to welcome onto the stage Noam Chomsky. We can go a few hours with just that. But this is very difficult for me because there's so much to talk about and I want to cover. And I did something that I haven't done since I was a first-year undergraduate. I assigned myself 5 books to read this week of yours. And I finished the last one at 3 in the morning this morning. And last time I did that was a sociology class in my first year when I hadn't read any of the texts until the night before the exam. And
we'll see if you pass.
Yeah, that's right. This was much more fun. But that, I think, is appropriate because I want to begin with your background, speaking of not reading the assigned text. In an interview, you said, we were talking about your college experience. You said, I was probably lucky in that respect. I really never went to college. You want to elaborate?
Well, I was in an academic high school for college-oriented kids, and it was very boring. Couldn't stand it. But I was really looking forward to college. The University of Pennsylvania, the catalog looked very exciting, all kind of wonderful topics. But when I got there, I found that each course was just a duplicate of the kind of thing that was going on in high school. So boring, I lost interest in that topic. And after about a year, I was ready to drop out. When, kind of by independent accident, through shared political interests, I happened to meet Zelig Harris, who was the leading theoretical linguist in the country, and he suggested to me that I start taking his graduate courses, and then suggested other graduate courses in mathematics, philosophy, psychology. I started taking those, and they were interesting. I got caught up in them, but I never had an undergraduate education, and I never had any professional training, professional credentials in any field. It was just kind of an eclectic mixture.
Would you advise that career path for others?
Well, it turned out to be lucky for me, but you have to survive in this world, and without credentials, it's hard.
We'll talk about credentials later. But you've talked about teaching, and there are a few things you've written that I want to... you actually quoted some Catholic priests in Latin America, some of the liberation priests, talking about the teaching, and they said that the problem with the teaching there is that teachers were more preoccupied with the transmission of knowledge than with the creation, among other values, of a critical spirit. From the social point of view, the educational systems are oriented to maintaining the existing social and economic structures instead of transforming them. Do you think this is a general characteristic of education?
And I think it's more general than, it's not universal, of course, there are exceptions, but substantially I think that's probably true. All of you can check your own experience and see whether it's true. The idea of educating people to challenge, to think for themselves, to create, to challenge what you're saying, for example, that's what an educational objective really should be. You're not giving the student body orders saying, here's what you must believe, but here's what I think, and you tell me whether it's right.
Does that impact on your teaching, the way you try and teach?
That's the way I try. You can tell whether it succeeded.
It worked for me. There's one thing, though, that you wrote, which I kind of took to heart a little bit earlier. I don't know whether I took to heart, but there's a really interesting discussion of the fact that Gandhi apparently thought that persuasion was a form of violence. And you wrote, if you're with children or teaching or involved in a discussion or talking to an audience, ideally you should not try to persuade them. That is, to get them to accept your position. And then you went on to say, this should be true of teaching. There's no point in persuading people. If you're teaching, say, physics, which I thought was a good choice, there's no point in persuading a student that you're right. You want to encourage them to find out what the truth is, which is probably that you're wrong.
Very often.
Yeah, and which is a really important point about teaching. But I was particularly taken with something that you wrote afterwards, for reasons that may be clear. It said, I'm always put off by people who are called good speakers, by those who can rouse an audience. That's just what you do not want. If you have the capacity to do it, you should suppress it. And I thought I want to get you to elaborate.
I think that's right. An orator, rhetoric is the art or science, whatever you call it, of persuading people by appealing to their emotions, their, undermining their capacity for independent thought and inquiry, for challenge, for invention, for creation. It's exactly the opposite of what it ought to be. I mean, I have heard speakers who were inspiring, and I can understand the appeal, but people should resist it, I think.
Okay, so I've been trying to think of things to disagree with you on here, and it's going to be hard. But let me put it to you this way, that I've often, with Richard Dawkins, debated the question of how to convince people or how to get people to think critically, and have said that you really, teaching is really seduction in a way, because you can't assume people are interested in what you have to say. If you do, then you've lost a lot of them. So it seems to me that if you're really interested in getting the step of critical thinking, you first have to motivate people to want to think critically, or to want to be interested enough in the topic to think critically. And that's where, if you wish, the idea of sort of rousing and interest. And I don't think if you can, unless you pass that natural sort of suspicion, then I don't think you can get people to the thinking critically unless you sort of...
The right way to motivate people is to bring up issues, problems, puzzles that challenge them, and then ask them, try to help them to think through ways of interpreting, maybe solving these problems. There's an old, if you go back to the Enlightenment, there were kind of two models counterposed for teaching. One was the concept of pouring a liquid into a vessel. And we've all been through that, and as we all know, it's a pretty leaky vessel. When you memorize those books to pass the sociology test, a week later, I'll bet you forgot what the topic was.
It was like Woody Allen. I remember his line about, I took a speed reading course and read War and Peace in 5 minutes. It's about Russia. Yeah, anyway, but
the other model, which was counterposed to this, was laying out a string along which the student pursues in his or her own way. So there's some structure to education, but the real task is to make it possible for the student to pursue, to investigate that structure, to explore it, maybe to modify it. Could be the wrong structure. And if you succeed in that, you've actually taught. Well, let me give you an example. The best math course I ever took, graduate course in modern algebra back in the 1940s, the instructor, who was a very good mathematician, would come in, race the blackboard, write down something on the blackboard, look at it, and ask the class, is that a theorem? And the rest of the session was the efforts of the class to either prove or disprove what was up there. The instructor, of course, participated things went in the wrong direction, maybe give you some hints. But it was basic. The task was not, look, this is a theorem, here's where I'm going to prove it, but you find out whether this is a theorem or this is false. And that way you actually learn something. You learn how to be a mathematician, not just to discover whether that thing written there is true or false.
To discover for yourself, which is really
Endeavors.
the only way.
And then it's
learn.
internalized.
Yeah, then it's internalized, which is, I think, one of the reasons that graduate students should be encouraged to not take classes, actually, is to...
Unless they're classes like this.
Yeah, exactly. That was an amazing class. Well, that motivated you, in some sense, to become a scientist, which we were talking backstage a little bit. I asked if you thought you'd want to be a scientist early on, and maybe you can answer that here.
Well, actually, when I was about 10 years old, I told my mother that I wanted to be a taxidermist. And the reason was because the word sounded interesting.
Oh, okay.
But after that, I was, smelling up the house for my chemistry set and that sort of thing. And I was quite interested in chemistry, which has a certain similarity to linguistics. It's the study of structures, what creates them, how they interact, and so on and so forth. I got attracted to linguistics partly for just reasons of background, accidents, but partly because it struck me right away that this is an avenue, gives you access to the nature of the human mind. I didn't know it at that time, but there's a tradition going back centuries which quite plausibly regards language as the unique and distinctive property of human beings, as distinct from other animals. Not just language itself, but the capacity to use language in a creative, innovative way. If you go back, say, to Descartes, the famous distinction between body and mind, the criterion that he suggested for distinguishing a human being with a mind from an animal or a machine, which in his metaphysics didn't have a mind, was the ability of every human, no matter what their intelligence, to speak creatively, to produce thoughts, to express them without limit, unbounded, infinite, and to do it in a way which is appropriate to circumstances, not caused by circumstances. So not a reflexive response to something that's happening, but in ways that somehow are right for the occasion. So like right now, we're not talking about, say, a soccer match that took place this afternoon. Wouldn't be appropriate. We're trying to formulate and create and articulate thoughts which are relevant to the circumstances of this meeting. And people do that all the time. That's normal. In fact, if you stop to think about it, probably 99% of your use of language never even gets expressed. It's internal. You can't. It takes a tremendous act of will not to do what we call talking to yourself.
In fact, I want to pick up on that. In fact, I want to pick up on that in a minute. But before we get there, there's something else you said that surprised me, which, because you often, and it pleased me, you often sort of compare linguistics and some social sciences to physics, and we'll get to that. But I mean, the virtue of physics is that it's simple. It's easy. The irrelevant details are easily removed. Whereas, as we'll talk about, you often bemoan that in linguistics and in cognitive science, the ability to really make detailed progress is very difficult because of all of the factors, and so linguistics is much therefore less advanced than physics. And you said to me that was an attraction and I was surprised to hear about that. So
it's an attraction, but I think what you described is also true of early physics. So if you go back to, say, the 17th century, Galileo had quite a hard time in convincing the funders, the aristocrats, that it made sense to study something that doesn't exist in nature, like a ball rolling down a frictionless plane. When they thought if you're studying motion, why don't you study the growth of flowers, something that's real, and the way the leaves blow in the wind, and so on and so forth. It took a long time for physics to get to the point where it became comprehended that if you want to understand the diversity and complexity of the phenomena of the world, you're going to have to study highly idealized, abstract models, even things which don't exist in the natural world, like, say, a frictionless plane. And then it's not that so much that you throw away everything else, you hope maybe somehow you'll get back to it. And that's the situation in the study of language in the 1950s. I mean, the study of language was the study of all the phenomena that you could accumulate. So the way, when I was a student, for example, late 1940s, your task was take some language, say Cherokee, and get a collection of data from it with an informant, some speaker or text or something, and then organize that data, put it in, segment the sentences, categorize what's there. You're finished, structural description, that's the end. Which includes everything that happens, right?
Yeah.
And it was also missing, crucially, the basic element that you should be studying, namely what's going on in here. What's going on in the mind of the speaker of that language that enabled him or her to produce and comprehend not only that data, but infinitely many more. Now that shift from the external data which you organize to the study of the internal processes that enable a person to interpret, comprehend, create thoughts and expressions, that's a huge difference. And you have to recall that this was the era of behavioral science, when the idea was that psychology is just the study of what you observe and organization and control of what you observe. It's a very strange notion, behavioral science. It's kind of as if physics was called meter reading science, because that's the data, and then you organize the data. But you want to move from behavioral science to authentic science, you move it from what you observe to what's internally going on in the mind of the person, which plans, organizes, directs, interprets the observed data.
Were you intellectually mature enough? I mean, was the fact that the field wasn't scientific in the sense that you and I would describe as science, was that an attraction? I mean, I often think how nice it would have been to be, all the low-hanging fruit in physics has sort of been taken, and that's a lot harder. And was that an attraction in some sense that it was just open for that kind of activity? Were you mature enough to realize that, or was that after the fact?
Well, actually, there's an actual parallel between what this development in the study of language and the earliest stages of modern physics. So if you go back to, say, the 15th century, scientists had an answer to everything. Like if this thing has boiling water in it, and I let go, the steam goes up and the container goes down, and there's an explanation for that. They're both going to their natural place. If two things are repelling one another or attracting one another, it's because of what were called sympathies and antipathies. That's the way it works. If I perceive this thing, what's happening is the form of this object is moving through the air, getting into my eye, and is implanted in my brain. So there's an answer to the problems of perception. It was when Galileo, his contemporaries, began to allow themselves to be puzzled about this and ask, what's going on? How is this working? Then they quickly discovered that they didn't understand anything. They didn't have answers to any questions. Instead of having answers to all questions, they had answers to none, because everything was puzzling. And that's the beginning of modern science. And that's pretty much what happened in the 1950s. It was assumed at the time that we basically know everything.
In linguistics.
In the study of language. And it was also assumed that a natural consequence of that was that languages could be unboundedly diverse. There's no limit to what could be a language. And each one has to be studied on its own without any preconceptions about what a language might be. As soon as you began to ask questions about why does it work this way, not some other way, what's going on in the internal process that's determining these and innumerable other data, you quickly discover that every sentence you look at is a puzzle. You don't understand why it's that way, not some other way. And you find some very strange things very quickly. So
let's talk about some of those strange things. When I was reading recent discussions of yours on language and mind, one of the things that struck me is related to something you just said, which has surprised me, because someone was asking you, we often talk about, and I've been at many of the meetings we've run here on extinctions and origins of early modern humans, the importance of language and communication. But you made the point that, in fact, from an evolutionary perspective, at least as far as you can see, what's important about language has nothing to do with communication. The important thing about language is not external, but internal. Maybe you could elaborate.
Well, in fact, traditionally, it was a guiding idea was that language is primarily an instrument of thought. The idea that language is designed for communication is a pretty modern view.
I guess the microphones we have are not working.
Not
okay,
working.
Good.
Oh.
We'll start again. No, we're just joking. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
Well, there's a traditional view, which I think is correct, that the core property of language is its use in creating and formulating thought. It's an instrument of thought. There's a modern view that language evolved as an instrument of communication. I think the reason for that is probably a misunderstanding of Darwinism. It's based on the assumption that any change that took place must be some small change modifying what was already there. Actually, Darwin at one point even said that if that's not true, his whole theory collapses, which is now known not to be the case. But if you look closely, animal communication systems and human language differ radically in every respect you can think of. So, for example, every animal communication system known consists of signals which are keyed to external events. So say a monkey, say a rhesus monkey, one of the ones that's extensively studied, has maybe half a dozen calls. And if the leaves are moving a certain way, a call comes out which we interpret to be a warning call. You know, maybe there's an eagle out there, you better hide. If there's a hormonal change, another call come out which we interpret as meaning I'm hungry or something like that. Human language is not like that at all. It's a free, creative activity. It can be used for communication, but primarily it's just used for thinking. And as I started to say before, if you simply introspect, almost all of your use of language is internally creating and interpreting thought. And if you look at the structure of language, it's completely different from animal communication systems. Furthermore, it gets kind of complicated, but if you actually look at carefully at the design of language, it turns out that the externalization, the articulation, what comes out your mouth, is kind of peripheral to language. The core principles of language are those that determine how you construct and interpret thoughts. And the way it's externalized doesn't enter into that. It takes some work to show that, but I think there's considerable evidence for it. That I think all of that reinforces the traditional view that language is fundamentally what was sometimes called audible thought. And we know it doesn't have to be audible. It could be in sign, could be any sensory modality. That's kind of all of the sensory modality that's used is external to and peripheral to and not really part of the core of language, which is a system of creating creating, inventing, interpreting thoughts.
Okay, well, say that. I know that your thinking changed dramatically, and in a way which, as we'll talk about, as a physicist, seems natural to me, but that the key evolutionary development that produced language was actually rather simple and quick, and that really the fundamental idea of language may come down to one or two things, something I think you've embodied called the minimalist principle, something called merge, which we may get to. But maybe you want to explain why you think that from an evolutionary perspective.
Well, actually, there's a huge literature on something called evolution of language, which is a very curious phenomenon. For one reason, because the subject doesn't exist. Languages don't evolve. They may change, but they don't evolve. What evolves is the capacity for language. That's quite a crucial difference. The capacity for language is something in your head, every human head. Now, we know a few things about the evolution of this capacity, very little. One thing which we know with a high degree of confidence is that the capacity for language is identical or virtually identical across all humans. So, for example, if you take an infant from a tribe in Papua New Guinea, which hasn't had contact with other humans for 40,000 years, which is possible, and you bring that infant here to Phoenix, it'll grow up exactly like children in Phoenix. It'll speak the same language, it'll become a quantum physicist, whatever, you know, maybe, if it's unlikely. And conversely, now humans left our ancestors began to leave East Africa maybe 50, 60,000 years ago. So what that tells us is in that period, there has been no evolution of the language capacity. It's exactly what it was then, and maybe some time before. Now, the second fact, which is a plausible speculation rather than firmly established, is that if you go back shortly before that, there's no evidence for language at all. The evidence in this case is archaeological, and what it shows is that there's a kind of a sudden burst of creative activity in one line of the many hominin species that were around, our ancestors. And you see it in the construction of complex tools and evidence for the existence of complex social organizations, symbolic representation, even pretty fantastic symbolic art, measurement of celestial events, maybe by phases of the moon and so on. All of this happens in a very short time from an evolutionary point of view. It may be roughly, say, 75,000 years ago, plus or minus. Now what that tells you is that whatever this capacity is that distinguishes humans from other organisms must have developed very quickly and therefore must have been very simple. In fact, what it suggests is that what's in the mind is basically something kind of like a snowflake. It takes a complex form, but just by virtue of the laws of nature, not because of some evolutionary process. That's just the way it has to be because of the way nature works. Now, a language is a computational system. A very unusual feature of human language, very unusual within the whole biological world, is it has a property called discrete infinity. So there's a 6-word sentence, there's a 7-word sentence, but there's no 6.5-word sentence, and it goes on indefinitely. That's different from almost anything in the biological world. Now, such systems are understood by mid-20th century, thanks to the work of Turing, Gödel, others. The general theory of computation involving such systems was quite well understood. And that suggests to us that that's exactly what emerged sometime, say roughly 75,000 years ago, and all of the diversity and complexity of language must somehow either derive directly from that or be peripheral to language, like the way in which it's articulated by the mouth. The sensory motor system has been around for hundreds of thousands of years, and our effort to take this internal snowflake and get it out of your mouth is a complicated process, and it's pretty well understood by now that that's where that external process, really peripheral to language, is where the complexity and diversity of language resides. Also, its mutability, that changes quite easily. And when you learn a language, that's what you learn. You don't learn the internal principles that determine the meaning and structure of expressions. One of the reasons you don't learn that is there's no data for it. The child is not presented with any evidence for that. What you are presented with evidence for is things like pronunciation, word order, what are morphological paradigms? Do you express plural or don't you express it? Things like that. That's what you have to learn, but it's all external to language. The internal part, what probably evolved, say, in that brief window, must be something extremely simple and invariant. Same for all languages.
Now, you pointed out to me when we were talking about this again last stage that we should put a caveat here that the views you express are your views, and in fact, you would argue that they're a minority among modern linguists.
Tiny minority, and I'm not trying to persuade you. Remember?
Yeah, no. But
you're supposed to investigate to see whether this makes any sense.
The one question I want to ask is why is that? Because again, as most of the physical scientists in the audience, I mean, that just, as a physicist, and we call it reductionism, or some people don't like that, but we've been very successful. The world around us is very, very complicated, but it seems natural to explain it in terms of very simple principles, and we've been very, very successful over 400 years at doing just that. It seems to me kind of obvious, if you were going to approach this, that that's what you'd look for. Why the resistance in linguistics?
That was 400 years. This is 40 years.
Okay.
If you look back I think the right place to look is the early stages of modern science. My own feeling is that psychology, study of humans, study of human thinking, action, interpretation, is really pre-scientific. It's pre-Galilean. It's got to move. It has to find a way to move into the era of science. That involves many changes. One I already mentioned, a crucial one. It requires the ability to be puzzled about what you see, to be puzzled about the phenomena, to comprehend that the apparent diversity and complexity of phenomena must be superficial. There's absolutely no way to acquire a language or other cognitive skills on the basis of just, say, induction from data. It can't be done. And the uniformity and the way in which these skills, capacities develop is actually very much like physical growth. Like you don't learn how to have arms and legs. You're designed to have arms and legs.
Well, let's not use the word design, can we?
Well, design just means it's somewhere in your genetic apparatus.
Just to be clear about that.
Design doesn't mean somebody designed.
But let me jump on that, because when I was reading it, you may have used this analogy yourself. I don't think I got it from you, but when I was thinking about your approach to language, it seems to me it's very similar to thinking about the eye, in the sense that we don't learn how to see. It's not something that is cultural or that we get. We have a mechanism that allows us to see. Now, once we can see, of course, and children do learn how to use their sight, I mean, in many different ways. They're born with the sensory ability, although, of course, they need the experience to be able to use it to then see things, but in very different ways, in incredibly complex manifestations. And it seemed to me, in some sense, your view of language is very much like thinking about seeing.
Well, in fact, a lot is known about human vision, and certainly there's a reason for that. We experiment with cats and monkeys, and we do invasive experiments, which you're not permitted to do with humans. and they have about the same visual system. So therefore, we know something about the visual system of humans. And notice you can't do that with language, because there is no other organism that has the capacity. So you can't investigate with invasive experiments with other organisms. But from the study of cats and monkeys, we've learned a lot about this. So for example, there were classic experiments roughly 50 years ago, which showed that if you take, say, a kitten, which is a newborn kitten, and you blind it for, you sew its eyelids together essentially, so it can't see for a couple of weeks, it will never see. It has to have experience in that particular period in order for the system to develop. In fact, the cells actually degenerate if it's not done. And furthermore, other experiments showed that the kitten has to have patterned stimulation. So if it has diffuse stimulation, like if you put something over the eye which just gives diffuse light, then the system degenerates, can't develop. Now, that's not, every biological system of growth that's known has properties like that.
And doesn't language, I mean, there's a few cases of wild child, right? I mean, there are a few cases where it wasn't done by scientists, but where children were not exposed to language or that level of communication, and their ability to manifest language was reduced.
Actually, a lot of this is lore, but there are some real cases that have been studied. The case that's best known, which some of you may know about, is a girl who's called Jeannie. There's books about it. You be careful about the books. Many of them are not true, but
we'll get to that, in fact.
There's a good study by the scientist who actually worked with her, Susan Curtis. This is a girl who was locked in a room, tied to a chair by a psychotic father. Food was thrown to her, stayed alive, but she had no linguistic experience, except for the first year or two of, I think it was 2 years of life, which may be significant. But when she was finally found at about age 12 or so, and of course released, and efforts were made to teach her language and sort of bring her into the world, she was, as you can guess, she was totally psychotic. I mean, all deranged. It's quite an experience. But she was very clever. And at first she deceived her therapists and the scientists observing her into thinking that she actually was acquiring language. But closer investigation showed that that was not happening. Whatever the requirement is, analogous to the first couple of weeks of life for vision, she apparently didn't have. And that meant that the ability to acquire language probably was lost. Now, there aren't many cases like that, but that appears to be the case.
That difficulty of doing those kind of experiments for ethical reasons is interesting, because, of course, it limits one's ability to understand a very complicated thing, which is human language. One of the points you make is that bees, of course, communicate. They have their languages, and in principle, you'd be able to do much greater experiments than bees. But there are far more books and work on human language, in spite of the fact
the evolution of human
language, in spite of the fact that you have this system which you can access. And
it's very striking.
It's.
I mean, if you look in the library for books on evolution of language, that's the wrong name, as I said. It should be the evolution of linguistic capacity. Huge library. Take a look at you'll have to take a look at on the internet, because you're not going to find it in the library, for studies of the evolution of the bee communication system. Very few. And that's very striking, because a bee they have a complicated communication system. A lot of it's known about it. A bee has a brain the size of a grass seed, I think 800,000 neurons, has a very brief gestation period. As you said, you can do any experiment you like. You don't need permission forms and so on. It's a perfect organism to study. So why is evolution of the bee system not studied? It's too hard.
And if it's hard, then human language is much harder.
Human language is incomparably harder, but there's a huge library about it.
You know, yeah. By the way, I bring this up because one of the many wonderful things about ASU is that we have a huge insect communication and social insect group that does study at least social insect communication.
But
and the best in the world is done here, I think.
And even the neurology of it is not really well understood. And that, again, is something, in fact, it's even more so than that. One of the most studied organisms is what are called nematodes, C. elegans. It's a tiny little worm, maybe 800 cells, has about 300 neurons. The wiring diagram's completely understood. Mm-hmm. But to try to figure out what that thing is doing turns out to be extremely hard.
Yeah, that's why I tell my biologist friends that's why I do physics, because it's so much easier. But the interesting thing is, I think it's a property. I have friends, and I know are in the audience, very interested in consciousness. And there's a theorem, I think, that there's an inverse relationship between what is known in a field and the number of books that are written about it. And consciousness is everywhere. And whereas if you got gravity, you just needed one book, right? And that's all you need. So I don't.
If you know the answer, you don't have to have a lot of
exactly.
books.
Now, in fact, actually, this is a quote of yours that I liked. It said, "The study of the formal properties of language reveals something of the nature of humans in a negative way. It underscores with great clarity the limits of our understanding of those qualities of mind that are apparently unique to humans and that must enter into their cultural achievements in an intimate, if still quite obscure manner." So I think that in some sense the lesson is that we have to be humble, at least, about...
In fact, if you go back, I mentioned before Descartes' proposed distinction between body and mind, that we don't accept that framework anymore, but what he observed, namely the inherently creative character of the way language is used for creation and expression of thought, that he didn't understand that, and we know nothing about it. Nothing. Same mystery. And this holds for voluntary action altogether, not just language. So we were talking about it before. There's a recent review by a very good scientist of what's known about the how voluntary action it takes place. So let's say my reaching for this. And what then he goes through what's known about the neurology, the muscles, what the neurons are doing, and so on. But he ends up by saying, we're now beginning to understand the puppet and the strings, but we don't know anything about the mind of the puppeteer. Nothing. So what is making me pick this up rather than, take this and throw it on the floor? About that, nothing is known. So yes, we have to be very humble. That's hundreds of years. We're exactly as ignorant as before, and we don't even know how to investigate it.
Now, in that regard, I want to slowly segue to the other part of your experience, and which is, you wrote a wonderful essay called Language and Freedom. Before I get there, though, it seems to me what the motivation to study language was to understand something which you often talk about as human nature. I was going to ask you what, I still don't quite know what the phrase means, human nature, but you seemed attracted to the notion that understanding human nature would help us understand social interactions, an issue that has been and clearly is very important to you when you get there. And you were attracted and have written a lot about Rousseau. Now, I remember Jean-Jacques Rousseau had a big impact on me when I read him, The Social Contract, because of that famous phrase, man is born free but lives forever in chains, which took me a long time to understand. And but Rousseau had this idea, which in your writing you've repeated a number of times, that somehow the natural state of man, and we'll just use man for that moment here, is a good one, and somehow society screws that up. So, for example, you wrote, actually at the time of American draft resistors, you were saying many who were beginning to recover from the catastrophe of 20th century Western civilization, which has so tragically confirmed Rousseau's judgment. And he wrote,
Here arose the national wars, battles, murders, and reprisals which make nature tremble and shook reason, and all those horrible prejudices which rank the honor of shedding human blood among the virtues. The most decent men learned to consider it one of their duties to murder their fellow man. At length men were seen to massacre each other by the thousands without knowing why. More murders were committed on a single day of fighting, and more horrors in the capture of a single city than were committed in the state of nature during whole centuries over the entire face of the earth. Now, is that really, it seems to me that that's wrong.
That's Rousseau.
Yeah, it's Rousseau, but I mean,
Yeah.
you quoted it. And the question is, do you agree with that? I mean, it seems to me that, in fact, one of your former colleagues, Steve Pinker, has written a book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, that in fact, if you wanted to choose a time to be around and have a happy, nonviolent life, today is a lot better than when you're being around at Neanderthal times.
Well, that's what he claims, but the weight of evidence is strongly against it.
You think so?
I think so. There's very good work by a serious anthropologist, Brian Ferguson is one, who's worked through his data and I think shown that it's probably wrong for about 95% of human existence, namely the hunter-gatherer periods. It's really with the emergence of state systems, the development of complex agriculture, they begin to get wars that are very destructive. I mean, there's killing among hunter-gatherers, but it's pretty limited.
But there has been moral progress. In fact, you wrote.
Well, one thing that he says is correct. I think that's about it. Since the Enlightenment, there has been moral progress. In our own lifetimes, there's been moral progress. So consider, for example, the status of women's rights today and in 1950. Very different. The status of civil rights, very different. The gay rights, very different. That's progress. And it's been going on slowly since the Enlightenment. But that's a pretty brief period of human history. And in fact, right at this same time have been the most murderous, destructive wars ever. And even 70 years ago, the creation by some of the smartest people in the world of a device that may destroy us all and is on the verge of destroying us all.
We'll get to that. As you know, I'm the chairman of the board of the Bolton Atomic Scientists. It's an issue that's really of great interest to me. You actually just reproduced a quote I was going to talk about for you. Is it that there has been moral progress in many ways, status of women in particular. You talk about your daughters versus your grandmother. And you say it's fairly brief, but don't you think it's interesting that coincides with the rise of science? Do you think that's coincidental?
No, it's not coincidental. Part of the contribution of the Enlightenment was to free inquiry from constraints, which led to the rise of science. So breaking free of these fetters that society had imposed did permit the rise of science, did permit moral progress, also permitted massive destruction.
Well, now we're going to get to the massive destruction, and you're interested in that. You wrote at one point, and the transition in this language and freedom, which is really trying to understand whether your scientific and intellectual background somehow motivated, in some sense, your social activism.
Could I make...
You can say whatever you want.
Take a look at the first sentence. The first sentence of this article says, I've been asked to talk about language and freedom. There's a lot to say about language. There's a lot to say about freedom, but I have almost nothing to say about and.
Okay, but here's one of the things.
How are they connected?
Here's one of the things you did say, which I find interesting, which I want to ask if it motivates you, okay? I mean, I like to believe that the intensive study of one aspect of human psychology, human language, may contribute to a humanistic social science that will serve as well as an instrument for social action.
I would like to believe that's crucial. Yes, I would like
to believe that. But has that been a motivator? No. I'm not saying you say it has, but yeah. in a personal sense, do you think that makes a connection in your own personal activism?
Well, if you look at, as a historical fact, no, they're separate. But there is a kind of a connection, not a logical connection, nothing you can prove, just a suggestive relation. And it shows up in Rousseau. So if you take a look at, say, the work of Rousseau that I quoted, which is the Second Discourse on Equality, that's his most libertarian writing.
Yeah.
He begins with a pretty strictly Cartesian view of animals as being machines, just reflexive machines compelled to do what they do by internal and external circumstances, without the creative character of human thought and behavior. And he then says, again in roughly Cartesian terms, that what is unique and distinctive about humans is this internal creative capacity. That's what makes humans different from the rest of the natural world. Then comes a thesis, which is not proved, but I think is plausible, namely any social arrangements that inhibit or constrain that free creative capacity are fundamentally illegitimate unless they can justify themselves. That means any structure of authority, domination, hierarchy, whether it's in a patriarchal family or in international affairs or anything in between, should be subject to challenge. It's not self-justifying. There's, I mean, you can see the chain of thinking. Notice it's not a proof, but beginning with the observation that specific to human nature, a term which I don't object to, we maybe could talk about that.
Yeah.
Inherent to human nature, what's special about us is this creative character, the need to inquire, to create, to act, to choose what you do, how you speak, how you interact, and so on. There's a kind of a chain of thinking from that to the conclusion that which is in Rousseau, in fact, that social structures which inhibit that are illegitimate unless proved otherwise. Like sometimes you can give an argument in favor of authority. So if I'm walking down the street with, say, my 3-year-old granddaughter, and she runs into the street and I grab her arm and pull her back, I think I can give a justification for that. But the point is that the argument is that any form of authority and domination requires justification. And usually you can't justify it, in which case you have to dismantle it and replace it by something more free and just.
Oh, this is perfect. This is a great segue. This is perfect. By the way, I want to let the people backstage know that we're going to go a little long. Instead of we're going to go about 15 minutes longer than intended, and the reason is I want to. So
I made a choice.
Okay.
How did you make this?
It's such power. Anyway, you wrote a piece in 1966 which changed your life probably in some ways, because it was a piece that first, I imagine for many in the public, brought you to the responsibility of intellectuals. A profoundly important piece in which you said it's the responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and expose lies. Intellectuals are in a position to expose the lies of governments, to analyze actions according to their causes and motives and often hidden intentions. In the Western world, at least, they have the power that comes from political liberty, from access to information, and freedom of expression. For a privileged minority, Western democracy provides the leisure, the facilities, and the training to seek the truth lying hidden beneath the veil of distortion and misrepresentation, ideology, and class interests through which the events of current history are presented to us. And it seemed to me that epitomizes what has been your role as a public intellectual. Is that your guiding principle?
Whether it's been the role or not is for you to decide, but it's certainly been the guiding principle, something that ought to be done.
And yet at the same time, yeah. Okay. I should say we're entering the part of the program where there's going to be a lot more applause, so we'll get used to it. You have, at the same time, pointed out, at the same time as talking about what the responsibility of an intellectual is, spent a great deal of time essentially castigating intellectuals, pointing out that the role of intellectuals has not been that. The role of intellectuals in our society, which I guess I first learned when I was in your class, which surprised me, is really been to be completely complicit in the lies and distortions, and in fact provide an underlying fabric and story on which those people can then use to discuss that. So.
It's unfortunate, but as a fact, I think that's a well-documented fact. Remember, intellectuals are the people who write history, so they come out looking pretty good. But you've got to take, as usual, you have to challenge things that look sort of obvious. If you think about the history of intellectuals, I think you can show that it's quite different. Actually, the term intellectual came into use in its modern sense pretty much with the Dreyfus trial in France, late 19th century. Now, today we admire and respect the Dreyfusards, Emile Zola, others who stood up for justice and so on. You look back at the time, they were a persecuted minority. The great intellectuals, the immortals of the French Academy, bitterly condemned and denounced them. How dare you challenge the august character of the state? You, a writer with no competence, how can you claim that our army is deceiving us, and so on? And in fact, Emile Zola had to flee from France. And that's pretty typical. Take almost any society you like, and you find that there's a fringe of critical dissidents, and they're usually subjected to one or another form of punishment. Depends on the nature of the society. So if it was in Eastern Europe in the last 50 years, they could be jailed, say, like Václav Havel was sent to jail. If it was in our domains in Central America, they'd have their heads blown off. We don't like to think of that comparison, but it's in fact true. The torture, murder, atrocities in our own domain, say Latin America, was much worse than what was going on in Eastern Europe in the post-Stalin era. But in both cases, there's a harsh repression of people who are critical of established power. And that goes back as far as you like. It goes back to classical Greece. So who drank the hemlock in classical Greece? It was the person who was corrupting the youth of Athens by asking hard questions that you're not supposed to ask, Socrates. Take a look at the biblical record at roughly the same period. It's a kind of oral history, but what's reconstructed from it. There were people who, by our standards, could be called intellectuals, people who condemned, criticized the king and his crimes, who gave geopolitical analysis and they warning that the acts of the kings were going to lead to disaster, who called for mercy, compassion for widows and orphans, and so on. Now, those are people who are called, the translation is prophets. It's a kind of a bad translation of an obscure Hebrew word. But in our terms, they were functioning roughly the way dissident intellectuals do. How were they treated? They were imprisoned, driven into the desert, and marginalized. There were intellectuals who were respected, flatterers at the court. Centuries later, they were called false prophets, but not at the time. And I think if you think through history, that pattern is replicated very consistently.
Let me give a quote of yours that I want you to comment. I have two quotes in that regard I want to comment on before we actually get to some of the specifics, which I want to get to. You point out that no one would be disturbed by an analysis of the political behavior of Russians, French, or Tanzanians, questioning their motives and interpreting their actions in terms of long-range interest, perhaps well concealed behind official rhetoric. But it's an article of faith that American motives are pure and not subject to analysis. Although it is nothing new in American intellectual history, or for that matter, in the general history of imperialist apologia, this innocence becomes increasingly distasteful as the power it serves grows more dominant in the world affairs and more capable, therefore, of the unconstrained viciousness that the mass media present to us each day.
I think that's a defensible statement.
Well, I hope so. You said it, but I think the point, and I remember this vividly.
And remember that this statement is the conclusion from extensive documentation.
And substantiated. And I have many pages that I've been turning over because we don't have time to read your substantiations. But I do remember you making the statement to me many, many years ago, something that seemed obvious, and that I guess if you asked a 5-year-old, I think is the way you put it, they'd give you the answer, but you never hear, which is, would you expect that this country would behave differently than any other country, and would you expect that foreign policy wouldn't be carried out in the interests of those who are most powerful in that country, instead of in terms of altruism? But we grow up with this illusion. I didn't grow up in the United States, but it was the same in Canada. The illusion that somehow this country was somehow morally superior to all others.
Yeah, it's called American exceptionalism. There are a couple of problems with that concept. That concept is held by every great power.
Yeah.
So there's British exceptionalism, French exceptionalism, and so on. Secondly, the exceptionalism is wrong. They're all the same.
They're all the same. Now, in fact, there's some great things I'm going to skip, but I want you to also comment on this quote, because this is also in regard to your view towards certain types of intellectual activity. In short, the experts on values, spokesmen for the great religions and philosophical systems, will provide fundamental insights on moral perspectives, and the experts on social theory will provide general empirically validated propositions and general, quote-unquote, general models of conflict. From this interplay, new policies will emerge, presumably from application of the canons of the scientific method. The only debatable issue, it seems to me, is whether it's more ridiculous to turn to experts in social theory for general, well-confirmed propositions, or to the specialists in the great religions and philosophical systems for insights into fundamental human values.
I think, again, that's defensible.
So what do we do?
What we do is recognize that people like us, I suspect virtually all of us, are a privileged minority. Mm-hmm. We do have unusual freedom by comparative standards. There's plenty you can criticize about the country, but by comparative standards, it's very free. The ability of the state to repress and constrain is quite limited for anybody who has a degree of privilege. Now, it's not true if you happen to be a black kid in the slums, but for people like us, people who've gone through college, who are relatively well off, have the resources, have the time, have the access to the internet, have plenty of opportunities, I think that yields conclusions about what we ought to be doing. I mean, quite generally, privilege confers opportunity, and opportunity confers responsibility, and responsibility means dedication to challenging, questioning the verities that are imposed on us by doctrinal systems and structural arrangements that are based on hierarchy and domination, and working, not only challenging them, but doing something about it. And to the degree that you have privilege, there's more that you can do. I think that's just as simple as that. And again, I think a 5-year-old would understand it.
Well, I told you, we're in that. We're definitely in the applause phase, and I'll go on because I want. It seemed to me that you end one of that essay with the statements about related to a Russian death camp paymaster or a German death campaign master who learned the Russians would hang him, and he said, "Why should they? What have I done?" And he said, you said, "The question, what have I done, is one that we may ask ourselves as we read each day of fresh atrocities in Vietnam, as we create or mouth or tolerate the deceptions that will be used to justify the next defense of freedom." So let's talk about some of those deceptions, which I think is one of the, I would applaud, because I think that's one of the most important.
You have to remember by
your point.
1966, when that was written, one of the leading specialists on Vietnam, one of the most respected ones, Bernard Fall, French military historian, Vietnam specialist, very highly respected. What he wrote at that time was that it is questionable whether Vietnam as a historic and cultural entity will survive the attack of the most powerful and brutal military machine of all time, namely us. That was right at that time. So I think those words were appropriate.
Well,
and if you ask what's happened next, it's repeated over and over again.
I want to go one by one through some of them, but at the same time, before we get there, I want to point out you've written a lot about this fact that there is a machinery that makes it extremely difficult to see what's actually happening, and that it's well organized. You've argued, and you quote Edward Bernays, who shortly before he was honored for his contributions by the American Psychological Association in 1949, wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society." He went on, "There's a trifling fraction of the population who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses and are therefore in a position to pull the wires which control the public mind. This process of engineering consent is the very essence of the democratic process," he put.
That's Edward Bernays, and it's important to remember who he was. He's one of the founders of the public relations industry. His first great book was called, in the 1920s, was called Propaganda. In those days, the term propaganda was used for persuasion, basically. It got a kind of bad connotation during the 30s and the 40s, so we now only use it for the propaganda of others, not for our own. But he was the founder of the public relations industry. He's a very respected Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal, hero in Cambridge, where I live. His first great achievement, what really propelled him to fame, was getting women to smoke. In the 1920s, women didn't smoke. He was hired by one of the, I forget which one of the tobacco companies, and he arranged things like having models walk down Fifth Avenue smoking, and that's the modern women, that's liberating, and so on. How many tens of millions of women he killed, we don't know, but plenty of them. One of his other great achievements in 1954 was to create in the country the fear that unless we defend ourselves from communism in Guatemala, we're going to be destroyed. That laid the basis for overthrowing Guatemalan democracy, brief experiment in democracy, imposing a vicious, brutal dictatorship, which pretty much lasts till today, destroying the country, hundreds of thousands of killed, and so on. Those are the achievements of propaganda for which he's respected. Another point that should be made is that what he was saying is pretty much characteristic of liberal intellectual opinion about the nature of democracy.
Let me go on from that. In fact, I don't know if he's considered a liberal intellectual hero, the professor of science of government at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, who you quote, "The architects of power in the United States must create a force that can be felt but not seen. Power remains strong when it remains in the dark. Exposed to the sunlight, it begins to evaporate." And then he said, of the Reagan years, that you have to sell intervention, or other military action in such a way as to create the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union that you are fighting. So this is discussed in the open.
That's 1981,
Yeah.
and he should be respected for his honesty. But that's pretty much correct.
In fact, the other person that amazed me that you often talk about should be respected for his honesty is another despicable human being, Henry Kissinger. And I wonder whether you might want to comment on that.
Well, Kissinger has some really remarkable lines, and what's important about them is not just that he produced them and that they led to actions implementing them, but that there's no reaction to it among the intellectual classes. So, for example, at one point must be 1971, he calmly transmitted orders from probably half-drunk Richard Nixon to the U.S. Army and Air Force, referring to Cambodia. And the orders were anything that flies against anything that moves in rural Cambodia. It's pretty hard to find in the archival record any statement advocating genocide at that level of clarity and explicitness. And those orders were carried out with horrendous effect. Now, all of this appeared in the New York Times. When the Nixon tapes were exposed, there was an article about what was in them, mostly about gossip. But if you look closely, one of the things in the revelation was this order. There was no reaction to it. That's the part that's significant that we ought to think about.
Well, in fact, that's not the first time, I think, that you would argue that the United States was involved in genocide. And in fact, you quote, you begin, and I want to list some of the things you've discussed and maybe debate a few of them all the way up to the issue that many people are expecting us to talk about at some point today, which is in the Middle East. You talk about the Nuremberg trials, and you say the operative definition of crime is crime that you carried out, but we did not. To underscore the fact, Nazi war criminals were absolved if the defense could show that their U.S. counterparts carried out the same crimes. So therefore, massive bombing and destructions of cities or civilian populations is not considered genocide because the United States did it.
And in fact, that was explicit. If you read, say, Telford Taylor, chief prosecutor, he says, well, wouldn't make sense to charge the Nazis with the crime of bombing of heavy urban concentrations because we did it even more than they did. So how can it be a crime? You know, in fact, and you have to recall that of all the tribunals, Nuremberg is the one that deserves most respect. The others are much worse. But that was the criterion for war crimes at Nuremberg. If they did it and we didn't, it's a war crime.
So you want to list some of the major times that we've been involved in genocide, perhaps going from Florida, Nicaragua, El Salvador, maybe have some, just remind people, especially the young people in the audience?
Well, you know, again, that's something all of us ought to know. Why are we here? What happened to the indigenous population? Are they around? Okay. I mean, that answers the question. And in fact, the perpetrators were quite aware of it. If you read the Founding Fathers, you know, General Henry Knox, first Secretary of War, on, they were well aware that what they were doing was exterminating the indigenous populations. We're a settler colonial society. And we're here because the indigenous population isn't here. Okay, pick the word you like, but that's a fact. A parallel fact is that to an extent that is only beginning to be revealed by scholarship very recently, our wealth, privilege, progress is based very heavily on a century of vicious slave labor camps where productivity, namely what are called slave plantations, where productivity actually increased very rapidly, more rapidly than in manufacturing, without any technological progress other than more intensive use of the bullwhip and the pistol. That's the basis for our wealth. Cotton production was set off the Industrial Revolution, and it didn't just enrich the slave owners. It created the manufacturing economy in the Northeast. Mills were the big innovation in manufacture. Created the modern financial system. Same in England. That's how the English Industrial Revolution took off. So based on horrendous slave labor, which in fact was replicated in later years, and extermination of the indigenous population. These are pretty serious things.
Well, it seems to me they're serious, but what's more obscene? Fine. What's more obscene, and I think you've argued this, because I've learned it from you, is not the act of doing it, is the fact that we forget about it, the fact that we don't talk about it, and the fact that we don't talk about Nicaragua, as you put it, was reduced to a second poorest country in the hemisphere, with 60% of children under 2 afflicted with anemia and severe malnutrition. And if it was comparable to our country, it would have been about 2.5 million dead individuals if you ramped up to our country. The fact that in El Salvador, people didn't talk about the brutal murders in that case the Catholic Jesuit priests,
the leading Latin American intellectuals,
and that those deaths weren't talked about. If the responsibility of intellectuals is to expose lies and truth, we need to keep talking about it.
Exactly, and it goes on.
Now, in that regard,
let's come to today.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's come to today.
We're deeply concerned about the rise of the so-called Islamic State, which is a monstrous development, no doubt about it. And where did it come from? Was it there 20 years ago? It was largely created by our hitting a vulnerable society with a sledgehammer, namely the invasion of Iraq, imposing sectarian divisions that barely existed, horrible atrocities. Out of this came extreme violence, sectarian conflict, tearing Iraq to shreds, spreading throughout the region, and an extremist fringe of this is now taking over a good bit of Iraq and Syria, and we're puzzled about how to deal with it. It didn't come from nowhere. Actions have consequences.
Actions have I told you. We'll keep going. But I want to. Actions have consequences, and in fact, there was a big issue. There seemed to be very little debate about whether forget the invasion of Iraq, but our invasion of Afghanistan was a just war, and you put it in an interesting way, I think, which puts it in perspective, because it's the questions of just war. Once the issue of universality arises, if the U.S. is unquestionably authorized to bomb another country to compel its leaders to turn over someone it suspects of involvement in a terrorist act, then, a fortiori, Cuba, Nicaragua, and a host of others are entitled to bomb the U.S. because there's no doubt of its involvement in terrorist activities against them.
It's kind of suppressed because now there's a story that we invaded Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban, bring freedom and democracy, and so on. But go back to what actually happened. It's not ancient history. You don't have to go to secret records. It's all public. The initial bombing of Afghanistan was announced by President Bush as punishment for the Taliban for refusing to turn over to us someone who we suspected of terrorism. Now, actually, they requested evidence. No, we don't deal with people like you by presenting evidence. We tell you turn them over, turn them over. They actually made some gestures, we don't know how serious they were, to set up extradition proceedings, independent trials, and so on. We don't want to hear anything about that. We ordered you to turn them over. You don't do it, we bomb you, period. That's what happened October 7th. Look it up.
Okay, I was going to talk about terrorism, but we're running short of time. In fact, we've gone over, but that's okay. There are two issues that I want to talk about. The first one is Netanyahu. What the hell's going on?
Actually, a number of my Israeli friends, the fringe of the dissident community there, people like Amir Haas, Gidon Levy, and others, are actually praising the election of Netanyahu. Says it takes the veil away from the common policies. And there's some truth to that, I think. But there's more to it. We should look a little bit about the history. Netanyahu is now being attacked in the United States because in a campaign speech, he said there won't be a Palestinian state in my lifetime. Well, in 2009, his party, Likud, the governing party, had an electoral program, official program. What did it say? It said there cannot be any self-determination for Palestinians in the land of Israel. That means Jordan to the sea. The same comment. In fact, go back to 1996, Netanyahu's first electoral victory. He was elected prime minister in 1996. The preceding prime minister, Shimon Peres, left office announcing publicly there will never be a Palestinian state. When Netanyahu came in, his minister of information was asked, will your government tolerate a Palestinian state? The answer's worth reading. He said, look, we're going to leave certain areas that we don't want for the Palestinians. They can stay there. And if they want to call it a state, it's okay. Or they can call it fried chicken. That's the attitude towards Palestinian rights. And incidentally, that's pretty much across the board. It's Netanyahu does it in a manner that may be kind of rude and offensive. But the attitudes of the rest of the mainstream spectrum are not that different. And it happens because we're supporting it. That's exactly it. The problem is right here.
There may be more questions, Israel, so I'm going to leave that. But I think I was surprised by a statement you made in 2004 about Syria. About Syria, actually. You argued, in fact, that it was really inappropriate to have Syria on the list of states sponsoring terrorism, that we shouldn't have them, that they were an ally, and that and it hadn't been implicated in sponsoring terrorism for many years, been highly cooperative in providing intelligence on radical Islamic groups. Has your view changed?
Well, Syria has pretty much self-destructed since then. So sure, it's no longer an ally providing information about jihadi terrorism. What's happened in Syria is a horrendous development in which the society is just collapsing into total catastrophe. It may never recover.
Okay, look, I want to, because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about foreign affairs. I want to end with the thoughts of the future, and also a subject that I can't help bring up given your writing. George Bush reportedly proclaimed that God told me to strike at Al-Qaeda, and I struck them. And then he instructed me to strike at Saddam, which I did. And then you wrote, and now I am determined to solve the problem of the Middle East, he said. Also, and in your words, also at the command of the Lord of hosts, the war god, whom we are instructed by the Holy Book to worship above all other gods. And as I mentioned, the elite press dutifully refers to his messianic mission to solve the problem of the Middle East, in fact, the world, following, quote, our responsibility to history to rid the world of evil. The early English colonists in North America were following the word of the Lord as they slaughtered the Amalekites, in the new Israel that they were liberating from the native blight. those who followed them, also Bible-waving, God-fearing Christians, did their religious duty by conquering and possessing the Promised Land, ridding it of millions of Canaanites, and proceeding to war against the Papists in Florida, Mexico, and California. Now,
Sustainable again, I'm afraid.
yes, but the question I'm going to ask you may not be the one you think. So, you once told me in an email when I talked about my concerns about religion, that you rightly, then this is a profoundly important thing. You don't care what people believe; it's what they do that counts. But beliefs influence actions. And it seems to me, and I'd like to hear your comment, that if you really talk about, if we go back to your argument for the responsibility of intellectuals, which is expose lies, is it not, therefore, our responsibility to expose religious lies?
Sure. If, say, a third of the American population believes that the world was created a couple of thousand years ago, exactly as it is today, yes, it is our responsibility to expose that lie and to tell the truth. On the other hand, if, say I'm thinking of a particular person, but could give many examples, if a Peruvian peasant who immigrated to the United States 30 years ago and has managed to create a decent life for herself under pretty awful conditions, is an evangelical Christian who has a prayer group every evening that goes to visit the sick and pray with them, I'm not going to read her a lesson in epistemology.
Okay. Well, I couldn't agree with you more. It's our duty to expose lies when they influence behavior, and especially state behavior in a bad way. And I think that, although you didn't intend it, all those quotes, of course, and many wars are justified by religious arguments. Although one could argue if there wasn't God, one would justify them.
But we should also remember that there's a secular religion which is even more devastating, and that's things like the concept of American exceptionalism. That's a secular religion.
Now, to conclude, to get to the end before, so we give people a chance to go to the bathroom, us among others. Yeah. There's an urgency that you ended in a recent piece you wrote just last year, and two pieces, that basically begin by saying there's nothing particularly novel about any of this apart from one aspect. The means of destruction that have now been developed are by now so awesome, and the risks of deploying and using them so enormous, that a rational Martian observer would not rank the prospects for survival of this curious species very high, as long as contempt for elementary moral truisms remains so deeply entrenched among educated elites. And you talked about, and you began to talk about the issue of climate change. About climate change and our future, in a piece called Human Intelligence in the Environment. And you pointed out an interesting debate between Carl Sagan and Ernst Mayr about whether we'd find life elsewhere in the universe, which is an issue that's closer to my own activities. And Mayr pointed out that great American biologist, if you didn't know, absolutely, that if you think about the longevity of species, the smaller the species, the ones that can reproduce more quickly are the more robust. And as you become larger and larger, the mammals essentially are less robust. And that if you think of life as a lethal mutation,
not in life, intelligent.
Intelligent life as a lethal mutation, that he argued you wouldn't expect it. It's been around for about 100,000 years, and you wouldn't expect it to survive much longer.
He says that the average life of species is roughly 100,000 years.
Yeah, they're roughly
years.
one extermination of a species extinct. We just had a meeting on extinctions, and we quoted that data on this stage, once every 100,000 years. So we argued that, in fact, humans have this potential to exterminate ourselves, and you're particularly worried about the fact that climate change is a severe issue, but you see, again, the same kind of effort to obfuscate the issue by American power elites for climate change that you saw for American military intervention. So I wanted to ask you to comment on that a little bit.
Well, anyone who isn't living under a rock knows that we're heading for a precipice. The human effect on the environment, climate change, anthropogenic climate change, is enormous. And the effect is already being felt, and it will be, if it continues the way it's going, it'll be very severe in a short period of time, maybe our grandchildren. So what are we doing? Well, for example, open any page, business page in the newspapers. Euphoria about 100 years of energy independence, about the great new production techniques that are increasing the use of fossil fuels, about how the energy corporations there happens to be a slight oil glut at the moment, but the energy corporations are poised so that if the glut declines, they'll be able quickly to move with new technology into producing more and more fossil fuels. That is driving us toward the precipice. We'll be the Saudi Arabia of the 21st century, meanwhile destroying the prospects for the lives of our grandchildren. Almost any issue of a newspaper or a journal has articles like that.
But you argue that that's an imperative of capitalism in some sense, that the idea to consider externalities, that economists consider the flow of money, but not the other impacts on human life, and those aspects are not included in costs. And in some sense, you argue that I think that that's an inevitable consequence of what you call the real existing capitalist democracy. And there's two quotes I want to end with. You say, within the real existing capitalist democracy, which you call RECT, R-E-C-D, RECT, it is of extreme importance that we become the stupid nation, not misled by science and rationality, in the interests of the short-term gains of the master of the economy and political system. Damn the consequences. Then the last statement, which I think takes us back to the very beginning, which is I want to end with it, is this question of human nature. Is this an inevitable consequence of human nature? You say there is something about us, our intelligence, that we're capable of acting in ways that are rational within a narrow framework, but are irrational in terms of other long-term goals. Do you see any optimism?
Well, I think we have to make a distinction here between individual rationality and institutional rationality, individual stupidity and institutional stupidity. For example, recently at Davos, when you were there was a poll of CEOs when they were asked to rank risks. I think they had 19 risks that they thought were serious. Climate change was not among them. The top risk was regulation, the one possibility of eliminating the disaster. Now that's institutional stupidity. If you had asked those individuals, what do you think about climate change? They'd probably say, I'm contributing to the Sierra Club. As individuals, they may be perfectly rational and sensible, but in their institutional role, there are certain requirements that they must meet. If you're the CEO of, say, ExxonMobil, and you're not trying to maximize the use of fossil fuels, you're out, and somebody else is in, because that's the nature of the institution. In these kind of quasi-market systems in which we live, transactions ignore externalities. Like if I sell you a car, we make a deal for ourselves, we don't care about the effect on them. And there's an effect, more pollution, more traffic jams, and so on, and it adds up. In the case of extraction of fossil fuels, the externality happens to be survival of your grandchildren. But in the institutional framework, that's not considered. That's a footnote, like in an economics text.